The moment Effie Ramsey squared her shoulders and looked Harlan Pruitt dead in the eye, every man in the Silver Spur Saloon held his breath, because every man in the Silver Spur Saloon had already learned that Effie Ramsey's squared shoulders meant someone was about to leave with his hat in his hands, and his pride scattered across the floorboards like sawdust. It was the autumn of 1882, in the sun-baked, wind-scoured town of Caldwell, Kansas, sitting right on the edge of the Kishom Trail where cattle drives still rolled through in great bellowing rivers of hide and horn, where the smell of trail dust never fully left a man's coat, and where a woman alone was considered either a tragedy or an opportunity, depending on the man doing the considering. Effie Ramsey was neither. She was a woman who had buried her father 6 months prior, who now ran the only decent dry goods store on the main street of Caldwell with her own 2 capable hands, and who had, in those 6 months, become the singular romantic fixation of nearly every unmarried man within a 20-mile radius. She did not want to be anyone's fixation. She wanted to keep her store, pay off the modest debt her father had left behind, and have enough peace and quiet at the end of a long day to sit on her back porch and watch the prairie sky turn colors that no painter had ever quite managed to capture honestly. That was all she wanted. What she kept getting instead were suitors. Harlan Pruitt was the 4th one this particular week, which was a new record even by Caldwell's enthusiastic standards. He was a stocky man with a red face and an air of absolute certainty about him, the kind of man who believed that his very presence was a favor he was doing you. He had walked into her store on a Tuesday afternoon when the light was slanting gold through the front windows and the air smelled of cinnamon sticks and gun oil, and he had set his big hands on her counter and announced, rather than asked, that he intended to court her formally. "I appreciate the thought, Mr. Pruitt," Effie said, in the measured, clear tone she had developed specifically for these occasions, like a tool she kept sharpened and ready. "But I am not looking to be courted at the present time." Harlan Pruitt blinked. This was apparently information he had not considered. "Your store needs a man's steady hand," he said, as though this were an obvious fact she had somehow overlooked. Effie looked at her store. She looked at the neat rows of canned goods, the carefully labeled bolts of fabric in their wooden slots, the evenly stacked flour sacks, and the precisely arranged hardware along the east wall. Then she looked back at Harlan Pruitt. "It has one," she said pleasantly. "Mine." This was not, strictly speaking, the end of the conversation. Harlan Pruitt was not a man who accepted the end of a conversation gracefully. He stayed another 10 minutes, making various arguments about the hardships of a woman alone in a frontier town, the wisdom of practical alliances, and the fine property he owned 3 miles north of town. Effie listened to all of it with the same composed expression she had learned from her mother, who had survived 30 years on the Kansas plains with that same expression as her primary armor. The Silver Spur Saloon was not where Effie spent her evenings by any means, but on this particular Thursday she had come in through the side door to deliver an order of dry goods to Me Holloway, who ran the establishment with considerable skill and kept Effie's store on a standing account for soap, candles, and the occasional bolt of calico. Me was a fair businesswoman and a reliable friend, and Effie had taken to delivering Me's orders personally rather than sending them by the boy she hired on Saturdays, because the walk through town in the evening air was one of the small pleasures she permitted herself. She had not planned to encounter Harlan Pruitt again so soon, and she certainly had not planned to encounter him in front of an audience. But there he was, standing in the middle of the saloon floor with a fresh resolve about him, and a small crowd of interested onlookers, including 2 trail hands still dusty from the road, old Silas Crane, who had watched everything that had happened in Caldwell for 40 years from whatever chair was closest, Me herself behind the bar with her arms folded, and a scattering of other evening regulars. And in the far corner of the room, half in shadow, sitting very quietly with a glass of whiskey, and a posture of absolute unhurried stillness, was a man Effie did not recognize. She noticed him the way you notice something that doesn't quite fit the pattern of a familiar room, the way you notice a single star in a sky you thought you knew. He was lean and long-limbed, with dark hair beneath a battered hat and a face that was weathered but not old, somewhere in the range of 30 or perhaps a touch over. He wore a plain working coat and trail-worn boots, and he had the particular quality of stillness that came not from laziness, but from a man who had learned that the world gave you more information when you weren't filling it with noise. He was watching her, but not in the way the other men watched her. He was watching the way a person watches something they find genuinely interesting, not as a puzzle to be solved, but as a thing worth paying attention to. Harlan Pruitt, unbothered by her distraction, stepped forward and launched into a second campaign. He had clearly refined his approach since Tuesday. "Miss Ramsey," he said, with great ceremony, "I have spoken to Reverend Aldridge. He is prepared to read the banns as early as next Sunday should you be amenable." The room went very quiet. Effie stared at him. "Mr. Pruitt," she said, keeping her voice steady with some effort, "I have not agreed to be courted. I have certainly not agreed to marry you. I would not expect Reverend Aldridge to read anything on my behalf that I have not personally approved." "You're a practical woman," Pruitt pressed on. "A store alone is a hard thing to keep. The winter's coming, and a woman is entirely capable of keeping a store through winter," Effie said, with a little more edge than she intended. "As I have already demonstrated by keeping it through spring and summer, and most of fall without any assistance from you." Harlan Pruitt was not finished. Effie could see it in the set of his jaw. She felt the familiar weariness of it, the way these conversations always had 3 or 4 more rounds in them, regardless of how clearly she had spoken, and she was trying to find the exact combination of words that would end this particular exchange without causing a scene or making an enemy of the man, because making enemies in a small town was a luxury she could not afford. When the quiet man in the corner spoke, he did not raise his voice. He did not stand up or make any dramatic gesture. He simply set down his glass with a small, precise sound on the wooden table and said, in a low and unhurried voice that somehow carried perfectly across the now silent room, "Take your time." Everyone looked at him, including Effie. He was looking at her, not at Pruitt, and there was something in his expression that was almost warm, the way a fire seen through a window is warm, at a distance that didn't presume. He was not telling Pruitt to be patient. He was not offering advice or interference. He was speaking directly to Effie, and what he meant was precisely what he said. She did not need to rush this decision or any other. She did not need to resolve this man's persistence on his schedule. She could take all the time she needed, and whatever she decided would be the right decision. It was such a small thing. It was such an enormous thing. Effie looked at him for a long moment, and something loosened in her chest that she hadn't quite realized was wound tight. Then she turned back to Harlan Pruitt with new composure. "Mr. Pruitt," she said calmly, "my answer is no. It was no on Tuesday. It is no today. And if you approach me again before I have given you any indication of a change in position, I will speak to Sheriff Daly about the matter. I wish you a good evening." Harlan Pruitt's red face got redder. He looked around the room for allies, found none, picked up his hat from the bar where he'd set it, and walked out with as much dignity as a man could carry when he'd just been refused in front of a room full of witnesses. The silence held for one beat, and then old Silas Crane cackled from his chair, and Me Holloway laughed from behind the bar, and the 2 trail hands went back to their drinks, and the room relaxed back into its ordinary Thursday evening. Effie let out a slow breath. Then, without quite deciding to, she looked back at the corner. The man in the corner raised his glass to her, just barely, just the smallest tilt of acknowledgement, and went back to looking out the window at the darkening street. His name, she found out 2 days later, was Theodore Ralston. She found this out because he came into her store on a Saturday morning when the light was bright, and the air was cool with the first real breath of autumn, and he stood at her counter with a list written in a plain and careful hand and ordered flour, salt pork, dried beans, coffee, and a spool of heavy thread. He paid exactly what was asked without negotiating, which put him already in the top 10% of her customers by her private estimation. He was polite, not in the effusive way some men were polite when they wanted something, but in the plain way that meant he had simply been raised to treat people decently. He was turning to go when Effie said, before she had quite decided to say it, "I didn't get the chance to thank you properly. On Thursday." He paused and looked back at her. His eyes were gray, she noticed, a particular shade of gray that reminded her of the sky just before a storm breaks and the air smells like iron and rain. "Nothing to thank me for," he said. "There was," she said simply. "You gave me room to breathe in a room that was running short on it." Something moved in his face at that, a small shift like light moving across still water. "Seemed like you had it well in hand," he said. "I just thought you ought to know there wasn't a clock on you." "Most people seem to think there is," she said. "Most people are wrong about most things," he said, with such plain conviction and so little drama that Effie very nearly smiled. "Morning, Miss Ramsey." "Morning, Mr. Ralston," she said, and watched him walk out into the bright Saturday street. She thought about him more than she intended to for the rest of that day, which annoyed her slightly and interested her considerably more. Theodore Ralston was, she pieced together over the following weeks through the reliable information network that was a small frontier town's collective knowledge, a man with a fairly clear history. He had come to Caldwell 6 weeks before her father's death, hired on as a hand at the Breslin Ranch 5 miles east of town. He was from Colorado originally, had worked cattle and horses most of his adult life, was 31 years old, had no wife living or dead, no children that anyone knew of, and was considered by Clem Breslin to be the best hand he'd hired in 15 years. He was quiet in the saloon and never started trouble, though there was a story from 2 years back in a town in the Colorado Territory that suggested he was not a man who stepped aside from trouble when it came looking for him either. He went to church on Sundays when he could, which was not every Sunday because cattle did not observe the Sabbath with any reliability. He came into the store once a week, always on Saturday mornings, always with the same careful list. He always paid exactly what was owed. He always said good morning and good day, and nothing else that wasn't directly related to the transaction at hand. And Effie, who was beginning to find herself looking toward the door at the particular hour he tended to arrive, told herself firmly that this was simple professional interest in a reliable customer. She told herself this with decreasing conviction as October deepened toward November. The day things shifted was the day Chester Alcott's wagon broke an axle on the main street directly in front of her store, spilling 200 pounds of Chester's lumber delivery across the road and blocking the thoroughfare in both directions. Chester was 63 years old with a bad knee, and the 3 men who stopped to help him were doing their honest best, but a load that size needed more hands and more organization than a spontaneous group of passers-by could provide. Effie came out from behind her counter, assessed the situation in about 4 seconds, and began directing traffic both human and equine around the obstruction, while also organizing the available men into a more efficient recovery effort. Theodore Ralston appeared from the direction of the livery stable with his coat off and his sleeves already rolled up, and without any conversation at all, he simply slotted himself into the work where the work needed him most, which happened to be exactly where Effie had been about to point the next available person. He glanced at her. She glanced at him. They achieved a wordless operational understanding in about 3 seconds and proceeded to get Chester Alcott's lumber restacked and his wagon wheel assessed, and Chester himself helped to a seat on Effie's front step with a cup of water and the reassurance that the axle could be repaired by the end of the day. When it was over and the street was clear, and Chester's wagon had been rolled to the smithy, Effie and Theodore were standing on the boardwalk in front of her store with the late morning sun warming the weathered wood, and Theodore said, "You know how to run a situation." "My father taught me," Effie said, and the small ache that came with saying it was familiar enough by now that she could manage it without letting it show too much. He always said that the person who figures out what needs doing first has already done half the work. Theodore nodded slowly, like this was information he was adding to a carefully kept internal record. Sounds like a man worth knowing. He was, Effie said. Then, because the moment had a particular quality of openness to it that she didn't want to waste, "Have you eaten? I have cornbread from this morning and the coffee is fresh." There was a pause. Not a long one, but she felt him considering it. "I wouldn't want to impose," he said. "You helped move 200 pounds of lumber on your Saturday morning," she said. "Cornbread is not an imposition." The corner of his mouth moved. It was barely a smile, more the suggestion of one, but it reached his eyes, and that was where it counted. "Then I'd be grateful," he said. They sat in the back room of her store, where she kept a small table and 2 chairs, and the pot-bellied stove that kept the whole building warm, and they ate cornbread and drank coffee and talked. Or rather, they talked in the way that 2 careful and somewhat private people talk when they are beginning to trust each other, which means they said real things slowly, and in between the real things there was comfortable silence that neither of them felt obligated to fill. He told her about Colorado, about the particular quality of the mountains in early spring, when the snow was still on the high peaks, but the lower meadows were already green. He told her about learning to work cattle, which he'd done starting at 16 under a foreman who was hard but fair, and how the work had suited him in ways he found difficult to explain, except to say that it asked you to be practical and patient at the same time, which seemed to him like the 2 most necessary qualities a person could have. She told him about growing up in Caldwell, about watching the town grow from a rough collection of buildings into something that was genuinely trying to become permanent. She told him about her father, how he had built the store from nothing, how he had been sick for 2 years before the end, and how she had run the store alongside him, and then more and more alone as his strength faded, so that by the time he passed she already knew every shelf and account and supplier by heart. She told him this matter-of-factly, without requesting sympathy, and he received it the same way, without offering more of it than she wanted, which was precisely the right amount. When he left he said, "Thank you, Miss Ramsey. That was the best Saturday morning I've had in some time." "Effie," she said. It came out before she thought about it. He looked at her and the almost smile came back. "Theodore," he said, "though most people call me Theo." "Which do you prefer?" she asked. He thought about it, which she liked, the fact that he actually considered the question rather than deflecting it. "Theodore," he said, "from someone who's asking which I prefer." She watched him walk down the back alley toward the road that led to the Breslin Ranch and thought about that for a long time after he was gone. Me Holloway, who missed nothing and said everything she noticed directly to whoever she thought should hear it, caught Effie at the dry goods counter the following Wednesday and said without preamble, "So, Theodore Ralston." "He's a customer," Effie said. "He came in on Monday as well," me said, "which is not his usual Saturday. I know because I saw him going in from across the street." Effie kept her expression neutral, though something warm and slightly inconvenient moved through her. He may have needed something between his regular orders. "He bought a spool of blue ribbon," me said. "What does a cattle hand need with blue ribbon?" Effie looked down at the ledger she was pretending to examine. She had sold him that blue ribbon. He had been somewhat deliberate about choosing the exact shade, which had struck her as interesting for a man who seemed to hold opinions about very few things that weren't directly practical. When she had asked, with genuine curiosity, what it was for, he had said, "Clem Breslin's youngest girl is turning 5 next week and she likes blue, just that." No elaboration. She had thought about that for 2 days. "He is a thoughtful man," Effie said carefully. Me looked at her with the expression of a woman who has been observing human nature across a saloon bar for 15 years and is not deceived by understatement. "He is also," she said, "a very decent-looking man who treats you like you have a functioning brain, which I note you find somewhat remarkable given the competition in this town." "Me," Effie said. "I'm not saying anything you haven't already thought," Me said cheerfully and picked up her order. I'm just saying it out loud, which is the service I provide. She walked to the door and then looked back. He watches you when he thinks you're not looking. I have seen it from the street. That is all I am prepared to say. She said it, and then she left, and Effie stood behind her counter for a full minute not doing anything in particular, which was extremely unlike her. The first snow of the season came on a Thursday in early November, not the heavy, serious snow that would come in December and January, but the first tentative snowfall, thin and pale and more like a suggestion than a commitment. Effie was closing up the store in the early dark when she heard the sound of a horse on the street and looked up to find Theodore on the gray horse he usually rode, a solid and sensible animal named by him. She had learned, after no one in particular and called simply Gray, stopping outside. He dismounted and came to the door, and his expression had something different in it, something that was not quite his usual composure. He was holding his hat in his hands. "I know it's late," he said. "I wanted to ask you something, and I've been arguing with myself about it for long enough that I decided the arguing wasn't doing anyone any good." Effie leaned against the doorframe. The cold air smelled like snow and the distant smoke of cookfires and the particular clean emptiness of the plains in winter, and she was aware, in a way she hadn't been of anything in a long time, of how she must look in this moment, lamplight behind her, the first snow beginning to settle on the step. "Ask me then," she said. Theodore was quiet for a moment, turning his hat in his hands, and she had the thought that it was endearing, this moment of plain nervousness in a man who was otherwise so thoroughly self-possessed. "I'd like to take you to dinner," he said, "at the hotel dining room, Saturday evening if that suits you. Not as anything more than what it is, which is that I have found myself wanting to sit across a table from you for longer than a cup of coffee allows, and I thought you ought to know that plainly rather than me dancing around it for another month." The snow settled on the step. A horse moved somewhere down the street. The lamplight wavered in the draft from the open door. "Saturday evening suits me," Effie said. He let out a breath that she suspected he'd been holding for a while. "Good," he said, with a quietness that was better than any declaration she'd heard from a man in years. "Good. I'll come at 7 if that's all right." "7 is fine," she said. He put his hat back on, nodded once, mounted Gray with the ease of long practice, and rode away down the snow-dusted street. Effie watched him go and then stood in the doorway for another moment, letting the cold air clear her head, though her head did not feel particularly muddled. It felt, actually, quite clear, clearer than it had in some time. She locked the door and went upstairs to the small apartment above the store where she lived, and she stood at the window looking out at the street where the snow was beginning to stick in earnest, and she thought about the way he had said he didn't want to dance around it for another month, the matter-of-fact honesty of that, and something in her chest did a thing she couldn't quite name. Something pleasant and slightly frightening in the way that good things are sometimes frightening when you have been self-sufficient long enough, that the idea of wanting something beyond your own reliable self-sufficiency feels like a new and somewhat dizzying territory. She allowed herself 10 minutes of standing at the window. Then she went and found her good dress. The hotel dining room in Caldwell in 1882 was not the grandest establishment in the world, but it tried hard and it succeeded in some important ways. There were actual tablecloths, which was something, and the kitchen produced a dependable roast that was well seasoned and cooked properly, and the candles on the tables were real beeswax rather than tallow, which made the light better and the smell considerably more agreeable. Effie arrived at the hotel at 5 minutes before 7, not because she was early out of eagerness, but because she was constitutionally opposed to being late, and she sat at the table she'd reserved and smoothed her skirt and told herself to stop arranging her napkin. Theodore arrived exactly at 7. He had washed the trail from himself and changed into a clean shirt and coat, and his dark hair was combed, and he looked in the candlelight like a man who was genuinely trying, not performing effort but actually making it, which was a distinction Effie had learned to recognize. He saw her across the room and the almost smile appeared, and he came to the table with the particular unhurried steadiness that she was realizing, simply the way he moved through the world. "You look lovely," he said after he'd sat down, and it was not a flourish or a strategy. It was an observation, said the way he said everything directly and without ornamentation. "Thank you," she said, and meant it without embarrassment. They ordered. They talked. The dinner was good, and the candles burned low, and the room around them eventually thinned of other diners as the evening progressed. And they barely noticed, because the conversation had taken on the particular quality of conversations that you don't want to end, where one thing leads naturally to another, and you keep discovering new rooms in a house you're only beginning to understand. He told her about why he'd come to Caldwell specifically, which was a story more purposeful than simple wandering. He had a brother in Wichita, younger by 4 years, who had gone into law and was doing well. Their mother was still living in Colorado in a small house in a town called Salida, and Theodore sent money home every month without making a great thing of it. He had, he said, been saving for 3 years towards something, though he was somewhat indirect about exactly what the something was. Land, she guessed. He looked at her. Land, he confirmed. A small place, nothing ambitious, good water and good grass and enough acres to run a modest herd. Near here. She asked and was glad she managed to say it in a neutral enough tone. "I've been looking," he said. "There's a parcel east of the Breslin place, about 80 acres with a creek on the south end. Owner might be willing to sell in the spring." She thought about that parcel. She knew it by description from her father's conversations with various ranchers. Good land, good water, not so far from town as to be isolated, not so close as to be hemmed in. A starting place, the kind of land that could grow into something if a person was patient. "That sounds like a good piece of ground," she said. "I think so," he said. And then, because he was a man who said what he meant, "I'd like it to be near town." For various reasons. She met his eyes. The candlelight was warm between them. "Various reasons," she said. "One reason in particular," he said, and held her gaze with perfect steadiness. Effie looked at him for a long moment, at the gray eyes and the honest face, and the way he was not pushing or pleading or maneuvering, simply stating a true thing and letting her receive it as she chose. She thought about the 4 suitors before him and all the ones before those in the months since her father died, and how none of them had felt like this, like standing at the edge of a meadow in good weather with all the time in the world. "One reason in particular," she agreed quietly, and watched something settle in his expression like a key turning in a lock. They walked out into the November night after dinner. The snow from Thursday crystallized now into a hard glitter on the street, the stars enormous overhead the way they only were on the high plains in cold, clear weather, and they walked slowly in no particular direction, because neither of them wanted the evening to end. He told her about the injustices he'd seen moving through the territories, and she listened seriously because they were serious things. The way the Cherokee and the other nations were being pushed further and further by a government that tore up agreements the moment they were inconvenient. The way Mexican families who had held land for generations found that land claimed by newcomers backed by law that had not existed the year before. He had seen enough of the moving frontier to understand that progress, as it was called, was a thing that moved over people whether they were in its way or not, and the people it moved over were rarely the ones writing the histories afterward. "My father thought the same," Effie said. "He refused to cheat the Osage traders who came through sometimes. Some of the other merchants thought he was a fool for it. He said fair dealing was fair dealing, and the law of supply and price didn't change based on who was standing on which side of the counter." "He sounds like a man I would have liked to know," Theodore said, and it was simply true, said without any strategic warmth. "He would have liked you," Effie said, and realized as she said it that she was certain of this, that she could imagine her father and Theodore Ralston sitting together, and having exactly the kind of conversation that two honest people have when they are not trying to impress each other. They stopped on the boardwalk in front of her store, which was dark now with the apartment light glowing amber in the upstairs window. The night was cold enough that their breath made small clouds between them. "Thank you for this evening," Theodore said. "Thank you for asking," she said. He looked at her for a moment with the contained expression she was learning to read, the one that meant he was weighing something carefully. Then he said, "I'd like to do it again, if you're willing." "I'm willing," she said. He nodded once, that simple decisive acknowledgement he had, and then he said good night and walked down the street toward where Gray was tied at the rail outside the Silver Spur, because he had come from the ranch on horseback and he had a cold 5-mile ride back, and he went without complaint because that was the kind of man he was. Effie stood on her boardwalk a long moment after he'd gone, breathing the cold November air, and thought, well, and then she went inside. November became December in the way that November always becomes December on the Kansas plains, with increasing conviction and diminishing compromise. The weather turned serious. The cattle drives were done for the year, and Caldwell shifted into its winter personality, which was quieter and closer than its summer self, people moving between fixed points with purpose, rather than the loose drifting traffic of trail season. Theodore came to the store every Saturday. He also came on 2 or 3 weekday evenings, which was a development that neither of them discussed explicitly, but that settled into the pattern of both their weeks as naturally as the ticking of a clock. He would come after his work at the Breslin place was done, which in winter meant late afternoon, and Effie would be closing up, and they would sit in the back room with the stove going and coffee or tea depending on the evening, and they would talk for an hour or two with the particular easy depth of people who have discovered that they are genuinely interested in each other's minds. He was reading, she discovered, which surprised her only in the way that discovering something unexpectedly good always surprises you. He had a small collection of books that traveled with him in his saddlebag, and he read slowly and carefully the way he did everything, which meant he had real thoughts about what he read rather than simply having read it. He had opinions about Dickens and considerable respect for the scientific writing of Darwin, about which there were strong feelings in Caldwell that he held his own views on with the same quiet certainty he brought to everything. She lent him books from her father's collection, which was not large but was chosen well, and he returned them with careful margins, not written in. He would never write in someone else's book, but with a particular quality of having been held and considered and put back down with meaning. She could tell which passages he had stopped at by the way the binding fell open. This told her things about him that surprised and pleased her continuously. She was falling in love with him. She recognized this the way she recognized other true things, not with alarm but with a kind of calm acknowledgement that this was the state of things, and there was no particular point in pretending otherwise to herself, even if she was not yet ready to say it out loud. Christmas came with a hard snowstorm that sealed Caldwell into itself for 3 days. Effie spent Christmas Day with Me Holloway and Me's sister, and Me's sister's children at Me's house, which was warm and cheerful and considerably noisier than Effie's apartment above the store. And she was grateful for the company, though she also spent a disproportionate amount of Christmas thinking about whether Theodore was warm enough 5 miles out at the Breslin ranch. He arrived on the day after Christmas with his coat white from the snow and a paper-wrapped package that he set on her counter with an expression of studied nonchalance that told her he was somewhat nervous about it. Inside the paper was a small carved wooden box, not large, the size that would sit comfortably on a dresser, and the carving on the lid was a prairie scene, grass and sky, and a single bird in flight, done with real skill and patience. "You made this," she said. It was not a question. She could tell by the look on his face. "I had time in the evenings," he said, which was his way of not making it into more than it was, though it was quite a lot. She ran her thumb over the carved bird, feeling the smooth, careful planes of it. "Theodore," she said, and then she didn't have any words that were equal to what she wanted to say, which was all right because she looked up at him, and he read whatever was in her face accurately enough. "Merry Christmas, Effie," he said quietly. "Merry Christmas," she said, and on a considerable impulse reached out and took his hand for a moment, just his hand, just briefly, and felt him go very still in the way of a man who is receiving something carefully. She had made him shortbread in the Scottish style her mother had taught her, which she produced from behind the counter in its own wrapping, and he looked at it with genuine pleasure, which pleased her in turn. They drank tea in the back room, and the storm outside continued its slow business against the windows, and the stove crackled, and the afternoon passed in a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. And when he finally had to leave before the dark came down hard over the road, he stood at the door with his coat back on and his hat in his hands and looked at her for a moment. "I've been thinking," he said. "About what?" she said. "About the fact that I haven't kissed you," he said, "and about whether that needs to change." She felt the warmth rise in her face and was glad she could hold his gaze steadily anyway. "What conclusion did you reach?" she asked. "That I'm asking your opinion," he said, which was such a quintessentially Theodore answer that she was smiling before she'd finished hearing it. "My opinion," she said carefully, "is that I would not object to it." He stepped forward and he kissed her, not tentatively but not aggressively either, just properly and honestly, the way he did everything, and it lasted long enough to mean something and ended before it meant more than she was ready for. And when he stepped back, he was looking at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before, something open and undisguised that was very nearly wonder. "Good," he said, a little unsteadily. "Good." She felt unsteady herself and was glad the counter was behind her. "You should go before the road gets worse," she managed. "I should," he said, and did not move for another 3 seconds, which she found entirely forgivable. Then he put on his hat and opened the door, and the cold air came in and he went out into it, and she listened to Gray's hooves on the packed snow until they faded. She pressed her fingers to her lips and stood there for a full minute. January was cold and serious and lasted the way January does, like a man who's been told he's overstayed his welcome, but is taking his time about leaving. The days were short, and the work of running the store in winter was different from summer, more about inventory and ordering ahead, and managing the stovepipe and making sure her accounts were in good order for the spring suppliers, less about the daily traffic of customers. She had time she did not always have to think, and she thought considerably. She thought about the store, about the debt which was manageable and which she had reduced by 1/3 since her father's death through careful management. She thought about what the store meant to her, not just as a livelihood, but as the physical thing her father had built, and that she had in some ways grown up inside of. The smell of it, the familiar weight of the ledger in her hands, the satisfaction of a well-organized shelf and a customer who found what they needed. She did not want to give it up. She was not certain she would ever want to give it up. She thought about Theodore. She thought about what he had said about the land east of town, about the parcel with the creek, about his savings and his plans. She thought about a life that had more than one center of gravity. He came on a Sunday in late January, which was unusual. He had his good coat on and he knocked at the side door of the store, the door to the staircase that led to her apartment rather than the front, which meant he was not coming as a customer. She came downstairs and opened the door, and he was standing in the January cold with an expression of such contained seriousness that her heartbeat did something irregular. "Come in," she said immediately. He came in out of the cold and stood in the small hallway at the bottom of the stairs, and she could see he had been turning something over for a while. She had learned to read the particular quality of his silences, and this one had weight in it. "Something's happened," she said. "Clem Breslin has been offered a job managing a bigger operation down in Texas," he said. "He's going to take it. The Breslin ranch is closing in the spring." He paused. "I'll be without a position come April." She looked at him steadily. "But your savings," she said, "are almost enough for the land," he said. "Not quite enough for the land and a start, not enough to do it right. Is this solvable?" She asked practically because that was what she was, and because she trusted him to want the practical question rather than the sympathetic one. Something shifted in his face, something that was not quite relief but was adjacent to it, the look of a man who has been received correctly. "Yes," he said, "I could hire on elsewhere for another season, or I could approach the owner of the parcel now before spring and ask if he'd take a reduced sum and a note for the remainder." "Would he?" "I don't know, he might. His own situation is not strong." He was quiet for a moment. "Effie," he said, and the way he said her name was different from how he always said it. There was more in it. "I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear it as information and not as pressure, because the last thing I want to do is be one of those men who's always pushing a clock at you." "Tell me," she said quietly. "I love you," he said, simply and without embellishment, the way he said everything true. "I have loved you since somewhere around the third Saturday morning in November, and I've been sitting with it because I wanted to be certain and I wanted the situation to be clear and honest before I said it. I don't want to say it and have you hear it as leverage or as a strategy. It's not. It's just true." The hallway was small and the January light was thin and pale through the high window, and the whole world had a quality of perfect held-breath stillness. "It's just true," she repeated softly. "Yes," he said. "Then I need to tell you," she said, "that I love you as well. Since somewhere around the fourth Saturday in November, though I suspect I was a week behind you on admitting it to myself." The look that crossed his face then was not the contained almost smile she was used to. It was completely unguarded, and it was one of the best things she had ever seen on any person's face, a kind of pure undefended happiness that lasted only a moment before his composure came back, but that she knew she would remember for a very long time. He reached out and took her face in his hands very carefully, and kissed her in the small, cold hallway with the January light coming through the window. And it was different from the Christmas kiss, fuller and less tentative, the kiss of two people who have said true things to each other and mean what they've said. When they stepped apart, she was steadier than she expected to be, which she thought probably said something about him, about the particular quality of his certainty, which was not the aggressive certainty of the Harlan Pruitts of the world, but the quiet certainty of a man who knows what he thinks and means what he says. "What are we going to do about the practical matters?" she asked, because she was Effie Ramsey and practical matters were not going to be made to wait politely in the corner just because something wonderful had happened. He leaned against the wall with an expression of such complete affection that she felt it all the way through. "Well," he said, "I have a list." She almost laughed. "Of course you do. First item," he said, "I'm going to speak to Owen Marsh about the parcel this week, find out what his actual position is." "All right." "Second item," he said, and his voice changed slightly, became quieter. "I would like to ask you to marry me. Not right now, not as a solution to the land problem or the job problem, but as the thing I want most regardless of whether those other things work out the way I hope. I'm asking you to think about it. There's no clock." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about what she'd said to every other man who had pressed the question, about her store and her independence and her complete lack of interest in being anyone's managed asset. She thought about how none of those objections felt the same when she held them up against Theodore, who had never once suggested that she was anything other than exactly what she was, who had never implied her store needed a man's hand or that her decisions needed a man's approval, who had asked her which name he preferred and meant the asking. "I don't need as much time as you might expect," she said carefully. His eyes were very steady. "How much time do you need?" "I'll tell you when I've had it," she said, and watched him nod with perfect patient acceptance of this. No flicker of pressure or calculation. Just a man who was content to let her take however long she needed because he trusted her and he trusted himself, and there was no urgency that wasn't of his own making. She had her answer by Tuesday. She went to the Breslin Ranch on Tuesday afternoon, which was not a short walk but was manageable in the clear cold, and she found Theodore in the paddock working with a horse that needed handling. He saw her coming and passed the line to another hand, and came to the fence with his expression already alert and careful. She stopped on the other side of the fence rail and looked at him and said, "Yes." He was perfectly still for one beat. Then he stepped through the fence gate and came to her and took her hands in both of his. His hands were warm from the work and her hands were cold from the walk, and the contrast was remarkable. "Yes," he said, not as a question, just receiving it. "Yes," she said again, firmly and with her whole self behind it. He brought her hands up and held them against his chest for a moment, and she could feel his heartbeat through his coat, not quite steady, which was the most wonderful thing, the evidence of feeling in a man who kept his feelings so contained. And then he kissed her there in the cold paddock with the horses watching and the January sky enormous above them, and it felt like something that had been set in motion a long time ago, arriving exactly where it was supposed to. Owen Marsh proved willing to negotiate. He was an older man with more land than he needed, and a desire to simplify his affairs before age made simplification harder. And when Theodore came to him with an honest account of his savings and a sensible proposal for the remainder on a note, Marsh listened and agreed. The deal was signed in February, a small parcel of 82 acres east of where the Breslin operation had been, with a creek running along the south end and a rise at the north end that caught the winter sun and would catch the summer breeze in the good months. Theodore took her out to see it on a Sunday in late February when the ground was still frozen, but the sky had the particular pale blue of early spring promise. They rode out together on Gray and her own mare, Clover, and stood on the rise at the north end and looked out over the land, and Effie breathed in the cold, clean air and felt the distance in every direction and thought about what could be built here, what could grow here, with time and work and the specific combination of patience and practicality that they both, each in their own way, carried with them. "It's good land," she said. "It is," he agreed. He was standing close enough that their shoulders touched. "We could put the house here, on the rise. The foundation would be dry and the view is clear in every direction." She could see it, a real house, not grand but solid, the kind of house that was meant to last. She could see a kitchen garden on the south slope where it caught the most sun, and a barn off to the east, and chickens. She had always wanted chickens and had never had the room for them above the store. "And the store," she said, because it needed to be said clearly. He looked at her. "And the store," he agreed without hesitation. "I'm not giving it up," she said. "It's my father's work, it's my work. The land will take time to produce, and the store produces now, and besides that—" "Effie," he said quietly, interrupting her in the particular way he had that was not dismissive but simply precise. "I know, I have never thought otherwise. The store is yours and it will be yours. I have never wanted anything different." She looked at him. "Some men would." "I am not some men," he said, and said it without arrogance, just as a plain fact. "No," she agreed. "You are not." They stood on the rise a while longer, looking at the land, and she thought about the shape of the life they were describing together, and found that it was a good shape, not a life in which she had reduced herself to fit inside someone else's plans, but a life in which two people with their own strengths and their own purposes had elected to stand in the same place and face the same direction. They were married in April. The ceremony was performed by Reverend Aldridge, which Effie noted with private amusement, given that Harlan Prout had spoken to that same Reverend about reading the banns not 6 months before. Reverend Aldridge either had forgotten this or was diplomatic enough to behave as though he had, and the ceremony was small and honest, the way they both wanted it. Me Holloway was there, and old Silas Crane, who looked pleased as anything, and Clem Breslin, who had stayed long enough before the Texas move to attend, and a handful of others who had become genuinely part of their particular corner of Caldwell. Theodore's younger brother James came up from Wichita for the occasion. He was a compact and energetic man, nothing like Theodore in manner but sharply like him in the eyes, the same gray that in James held a lawyer's quick intelligence rather than a cattleman's steady patience. He took Effie's hand at the reception me threw in the back room of the Silver Spur and said, with a directness that she recognized as a family trait, "He's been a different man since he came to this town. A better kind of different. I just want you to know that I see it." "He'd say the same of you," Effie said. James laughed. "He wouldn't. He'd say I've always been exactly the same, which is his way of saying he's proud of me without having to say the word proud." "I'll learn to translate," she said. "You probably already have," James said, and went to get himself another drink. The house on the rise went up in June. Theodore had the skill for the framing, and between him and the two men he hired, and the community raising that Caldwell organized, because that was simply what frontier communities did for each other when there was building to be done. The shell of it was up in 3 days, and the whole thing finished enough to live in by the end of the month. It was 2 rooms at first with the intention of more, because intention and reality moved at different speeds on the frontier, and both of them understood this. She kept the store. She rode Clover into town 4 days a week, and managed the business she had built from her father's foundation. And on the days she was at the ranch, she worked on the kitchen garden and the beginnings of the household and the steady arithmetic of what needed doing next. Theodore worked the land during the day, building toward the herd he planned to start small and grow carefully, and he was home in the evenings, and she learned the rhythms of him the way you learn the rhythms of a place, which roads are smooth and which are rough, and where the beautiful views are, and all of it suited her in a way she had not been certain any shared life could suit her. They fought sometimes, because they were both people with opinions and both people who said what they meant, and 2 such people will sometimes mean different things and say them with equal conviction. They fought about money once, in August, about whether to expand the store's inventory into a new line that Effie thought was promising and Theodore thought was risky, and it was a real argument with real heat in it. They fought about the fence on the eastern property line twice. They fought about Theodore's habit of working until full dark when she would have preferred him home at a reasonable hour, and about her habit of bringing the store's account ledgers to bed to work on them by lamplight, which he said was fine, except that the lamplight kept him awake. What they did not do was stop talking. What they did not do was be dishonest about what they were feeling in order to keep the surface smooth. They had both seen enough of what managed silences could do to a household to know that the short discomfort of a real conversation was always better than the long accumulation of swallowed things, and they had the particular advantage of both being people who said what they meant, which meant that when they were wrong they could say that too. In September, Effie began to suspect something that was confirmed by the town's doctor in October, and she came home from town on a Wednesday with the information settled inside her and sat in the kitchen watching Theodore come in from the field in the late afternoon light, his coat dusty and his face tired in the good way that came from real work well done, and waited until he had washed and sat down before she said it. "We're going to have a baby," she said. "The doctor says April." Theodore set down his cup very carefully. He looked at her across the table with those gray eyes that she knew so well now that she could read the way she read the prairie weather, with attention and respect for what they told her. What she saw there was a thing so full and so undefended that she felt it like a physical warmth. "April," he said. "April," she confirmed. He got up from the table and came around to her and sat beside her and put his arm around her, and she leaned into him, and they sat like that for a long time while the evening settled over the land outside their windows, the land that was theirs, the house that was theirs, the future they had built with intention and patience, and the particular courage of people who know what they want and are not ashamed of wanting it. "Are you frightened?" he asked quietly, because he always asked the real questions. "A little," she said honestly. "Are you?" "Yes," he said, "and very glad both at once." "Both at once," she agreed. He pressed a kiss to her hair, and the lamp burned warm and the Kansas night came down over the prairie outside, and the cattle moved somewhere in the dark in the low, restless way they did in cool weather, and it was exactly as real and as good as any life she had ever imagined, which was to say more real and more good than she had sometimes let herself imagine. She did not give up the store. She worked it through the winter, accommodating her changing condition with the same practical efficiency she applied to everything, hiring a girl named Clara Webb, 17 and sharp and quick to learn, to help on the busier days. Clara turned out to be one of the best decisions Effie had made in her professional life, arriving every morning with the specific energy of a young person who is genuinely interested in the work. And Effie found herself teaching in the way her father had taught her, not as a performance, but as a straightforward transmission of what she knew to someone worth knowing it. Christmas that year was different from the Christmas before. The house was warm, and the kitchen was full of good smells, and James came up from Wichita again, and Theodore's mother made the journey from Colorado, which was a long way for a woman of 60 who traveled by stage. But she came, and Effie liked her immediately in the way you immediately like people who are essentially the older version of someone you love. Her name was Ruth, and she had the same gray eyes and the same quality of patient directness, and she sat at Effie's table and looked around the house and said, "He told me in a letter that you were someone worth coming to see. He was right." "He usually is," Effie said. "Don't tell him I said this," Ruth said, with a dry precision that was entirely her son's, "but he is. Usually." Theodore, overhearing from the other room, said nothing, which was itself an eloquent response. The baby came in March, ahead of the April estimate by 3 weeks, arriving with the urgency that seemed to characterize strong opinions, on a Tuesday morning when the sky was the pale, uncertain blue of very early spring, and the ground was still hard with the last of the winter frost. The doctor came in time, and Me Holloway came because Me Holloway was the kind of friend who came, and Theodore stayed close to the house all day with the transparent pretense of attending to things that did not particularly need attending to in the yard. The baby was a boy. He was small and red-faced and furiously vocal about his opinions, which Effie thought was entirely appropriate given his parentage. And when the doctor placed him in Theodore's arms and Theodore stood by the window with the baby held against his chest, looking down at this small new person with an expression of pure and completely unguarded astonishment, Effie thought she had never seen anything so thoroughly worth seeing in all her life. "He looks like you," Theodore said. His voice was not quite steady. "He has your eyes," she said. Even this newly she could see the gray in them. "What do we name him?" Theodore asked and looked at her, and she had been thinking about this for months in the considering way she thought about important things. "William," she said, "for my father." Theodore was quiet for a moment, and she saw him understand what she was giving this child, the through line between what was and what would be. "William," he agreed. "Good, that's a good name." William Theodore Ralston came home to the ranch with his parents in late March, and proceeded to make his views on hunger, sleep, and the general injustice of the world known at reliable intervals. He was healthy and demanding, and occasionally reduced Effie to a state of pure exhausted love that she had not known was available before it arrived. Theodore proved himself in these months with the same quiet competence he brought to everything, present in the night when presence was needed, not in the way of a man doing a favor, but in the way of a man doing his part, because this was his son and his household, and that was simply how things were. Spring came for real, finally, with the conviction of something that has been delayed and is now making up for lost time. The land greened up along the creek, and the sky turned to the deep blue that was the Kansas plains at its best. And Effie rode into town with William in the carrier she had made after the pattern her grandmother had taught, and she ran her store and came home in the evenings to the house on the rise, and the life was full and complicated, and exactly as she had chosen it to be. Clara Webb, who had grown up considerably in the months of working the store, was now capable of managing full days with only occasional direction, which freed Effie in ways that she used with characteristic efficiency. Adding a new line of dry goods that Theodore had eventually conceded was the right call, extending the store's credit to several farming families who she judged reliable but whose current cash situation was constrained by the vagaries of the harvest. She kept accounts that were meticulous and debts that continued to diminish, and by the second spring, She had paid off the last of her father's note and stood in her store on the evening after the final payment and looked at the clear column in the ledger with a feeling that was something between pride and grief and love for the man whose work this had been before it became hers. She told Theodore that evening, sitting on the porch in the spring dusk with William asleep inside and the prairie going from gold to purple to the deep blue that precedes the stars. He reached over and took her hand. "He'd be proud of you," he said. "I know," she said. She said it without false modesty, because her father had raised her to know the difference between arrogance and simple, accurate self-knowledge, and she had worked for this, and she was allowed to know that. The night came down around them, and the stars appeared in their thousands the way they did on the plains, prodigal and brilliant, and somewhere out on the land the cattle moved, and the creek ran, and the kitchen garden that had made it through its first full season was producing in the earnest way of things that have survived their establishment, and are now doing what they were planted to do. "Tell me something," Theodore said, after a comfortable quiet. "What?" "Tell me something you want," he said. "For the future, something you haven't told me yet." She thought about it genuinely. "A second room," she said, "for William when he's older, and I'd like a proper reading chair by the window in the bedroom." "Both of those are achievable," he said. And she said with a slight warmth in her voice that the darkness hid, "I think I would like William to have a brother or a sister eventually, when the timing is sensible." She felt him smile in the dark. "That also seems achievable," he said. "You are a very practical man," she said. "I learned it from you," he said, which was not quite true but was such a kind thing to say that she did not correct him. Harlan Prout, for what it was worth, had married a woman from Wichita in the spring and moved north, and was by all accounts satisfied with his situation, which Effie thought was genuinely good news. She did not wish him ill. She had simply never intended to be the vehicle of his satisfaction, and she was glad he had found a better arrangement for everyone. Old Silas Crane died in September, peacefully, in the chair he had occupied for most of Effie's life, which seemed to her a fitting and dignified way for a man who had witnessed 40 years of Caldwell to conclude his tenure. The town mourned him with the genuine affection of people who have known someone for so long that they have ceased to imagine the place without them. Effie went to the service and stood in the autumn light and thought about the way a town carries its history and its people, and how those people eventually become part of the land. Mee Holloway, who it turned out had been quietly corresponding with a man from Topeka for over a year, announced in October that she was considering selling the Silver Spur and moving north, and the town's reaction to this was a complex thing involving considerable consternation and considerable genuine happiness for me, and considerable commercial concern from the various people who depended on the Silver Spur as an economic and social institution. Effie talked with me about it over 2 long evenings and encouraged her without reservation, which me received with the gratitude of someone who has been waiting for that specific permission. "You are one of the most useful friends a person can have," me said, "because you tell me what you actually think." "You would know if I didn't," Effie said. "I would," me agreed, "and I would be furious." She looked at Effie across the table with the particular affection of women who have known each other through several different versions of themselves. "You are happy," she said, not as a question. "I am," Effie said, and it was simple and true, and she said it the way Theodore had taught her to say true things, without dressing it up or undercutting it. "Good," me said firmly. "You deserve it, and so does he, and I intend to come back and visit the 2 of you regularly, so don't think you're rid of me." "I would not dare to think it," Effie said. The second winter on the ranch was easier than the first. The house was better insulated, which Theodore had spent part of the fall improving, and William, who was now crawling with determined efficiency and beginning to pull himself upright against anything that would support his weight, had the ability to make even the darkest January days feel inhabited in a way that reminded Effie of the way a good lamp changes a room. She wrote to Ruth Ralston in Colorado every month, and Ruth wrote back in a hand that was clear and precise. Letters that contained observations about the weather and the neighbors and the small events of a life lived quietly and independently, and occasionally passages of such dry wit that Effie laughed out loud and read them to Theodore, who smiled the deep, quiet smile he had for things that came from home. James Ralston won a significant case in Wichita in the spring and wrote Theodore a letter about it that was longer than his usual letters, and Theodore read it twice and then sat down and wrote back. And Effie could see from across the room that the return letter was also longer than usual, and this gave her a quiet pleasure she did not mention, because she knew Theodore would say nothing that needed to be said about it. William took his first steps on a Thursday morning in April, just past his first birthday, unsteady and determined, navigating the kitchen floor from the leg of the table to Effie's knee with an expression of furious concentration that she thought she might remember for the rest of her life. Theodore was there, having come in from an early morning task, and they looked at each other across the kitchen with the shared knowledge of parents who have been given a gift they did not know they were waiting for. And then William sat down suddenly on the floor and looked around with an expression of genuine surprise at his own accomplishment. "He'll be running before the week is out," Theodore said. "God help us," Effie said, and they were both laughing, there in the morning kitchen with the April light coming through the windows and the coffee warming on the stove and the land visible beyond the glass going green again with the return of the good season. By the following autumn, Effie's store had become something her father had never quite achieved in his lifetime, not for lack of trying but for lack of time, which was the thing the frontier took most reliably. She had established a proper credit account system with 3 of the major trail suppliers out of Kansas City, which meant she could carry goods on terms rather than cash forward, which meant she could maintain a fuller inventory through the lean winter months and be better stocked for the spring drives when they began. She hired Clara Webb full-time, which Clara received with the dignified restraint of someone who has been waiting to be recognized and is choosing not to make a scene about it, and she promoted her to a kind of junior partnership in the daily management that Clara performed with an efficiency that frankly impressed Effie, who had not thought she was easy to impress. The second pregnancy arrived in the way of things that are welcome and slightly inconvenient in their timing, in the middle of the spring ordering season, which meant Effie spent several months being more tired than she would have preferred while also managing an unusually busy period for the business. She managed it because she was Effie Ramsey, now Effie Ralston, and managing things was simply what she did, and Theodore managed alongside her because that was simply what he did. The daughter arrived in November, in a snowstorm that seemed personally designed to be dramatic about the occasion, delivered this time with me's sister serving as midwife, because the doctor was 3 miles away on another call, and the storm was too thick to wait. She was quieter than William had been at the outset, which was misleading, because by the time she was a month old it was clear she had opinions fully equal to her brother's, expressed with more deliberate precision. They named her Mary Ruth, the Mary for Theodore's grandmother and the Ruth for his mother, who received the letter about this with a response that arrived 2 weeks later and contained more visible emotion than Ruth Ralston's letters normally permitted, which made Theodore read the relevant passage 3 times before folding it carefully and putting it in the tin box he kept for letters worth keeping. Mary Ruth Ralston grew up, in the years that followed, in full knowledge that she was named after 2 women worth naming a child after, which Effie considered an important thing to know from the beginning. The years moved in the way that good years move, quickly in retrospect and fully in the living of them. Caldwell grew and changed as the cattle trade shifted, as the railroad lines pushed further west and the nature of the trail business altered, as the rough edges of frontier life gradually, not disappeared, but softened. New businesses came and some old ones went, and through it all Effie's store remained, not merely surviving but genuinely thriving, because Effie had the particular combination of attention and adaptability that allowed a business to grow with its context rather than being left behind by it. Theodore's herd grew steadily from the modest start he had made, expanded by careful purchases and a reputation among other ranchers for reliability and fair dealing that meant he was consistently offered first look at good stock when it was available. He bought a second parcel of land adjacent to the first when the opportunity arose, bringing the total acreage to a proper working operation, and he hired 2 hands to help him manage it. He was known in the county as a man who paid on time, treated his horses well, and whose word was as good as a written note, which in 1886 Kansas was among the highest compliments available. He built the reading chair Effie had asked for in the second year of their marriage, not bought it but built it, in the long evenings of that second winter, with the same patient skill that had produced the carved wooden box she still kept on her dresser. And when it was finished and set in the bedroom window, she sat in it and looked out at the land in the winter evening and said, "This is exactly right." "I know what you like," he said simply, and went back to his book. She looked at him across the room, at this man who had sat in the corner of a saloon and said 2 words that had given her enough room to breathe, and in that room had found its way to becoming her entire life. And she thought about the particular way chance and character combine to produce the things that last. She thought about the morning in the Silver Spur, the 4 suitors, the 5th man in the corner, and how everything that had followed from that moment of simple, uncalculating grace. "Theodore," she said. He looked up from his book. "I have never thanked you properly," she said, "for the Silver Spur, for saying what you said." Thought about it genuinely the way he always thought about what you said to him. "You thanked me the next day in the store," he said. "I remember it exactly." "Not properly," she said. "Not for what it actually was." He set the book down and looked at her, and there was nothing in his face that was not present, nothing managed or deflected. "What do you think it actually was?" he asked. "The first honest thing a man had said to me in months," she said, "which was that I was allowed to take my time. That nobody had a claim on my hurry, that I could make my decisions at my own pace and the world could wait." She paused. It was such a small thing to say, and it was so large a thing to mean. He was quiet for a moment. "I just thought you ought to know someone in the room was on your side," he said. "You were," she said. "I still am," he said. "Always." She looked at him, and he looked at her across the room with the lamplight between them. This room they had built and furnished with intention, in this house on the rise that they had raised together on land that bore both their futures. And she felt the full weight of it, not as burden but as substance, the genuine good weight of a life that was exactly what you had made it. William was 4 and Mary Ruth was nearly 3 and asleep down the hall, and outside the window the Kansas winter was making its dark and brilliant case. The stars spread from horizon to horizon in the way that still made her stop and look every time, because some things should not be allowed to become ordinary no matter how familiar they become. "Read to me," she said, from the reading chair. He picked up the book. "Where did we leave off?" "The part where everyone is about to be wrong about everyone else," she said. "Which is most of the book," he said. "Most of the good ones," she agreed. He read, and the lamp burned, and the children slept, and the cattle moved in the dark over the frozen grass, and the creek ran south under its skin of ice, and the town 5 miles west was going about its Thursday evening business with the reliable rumble of ordinary life. And in the window of the bedroom on the rise, in the chair built with patient and loving hands, Effie Ralston sat with her chin on her hand and listened to her husband read and felt, entirely and without reservation, that she had taken her time and used it well. She had taken her time. And everything that had come from it, every wonderful and difficult and ordinary and extraordinary thing, had been worth every moment of the waiting. The stars did their slow turn overhead, indifferent and magnificent, the way the stars had always been over this land, over all the lives that had been lived here and all the lives that were still to come. And in the house on the rise, the lamp burned warm against the winter dark, and the story of Effie and Theodore Ralston, who had found each other in the only way that good things are ever truly found. With patience and honesty and the willingness to simply say the true thing at the true moment and let the rest follow, continued in all the quiet and beautiful detail of an ordinary evening in an extraordinary life, until the book was finished and the lamp was turned low and they went to their rest in the way of people who have earned their sleep and know it, and tomorrow would come with its own work and its own grace, and they would be ready for it together, the way they had always been.